All right, here we go. So I'm here with my buddy Josh, and we're talking about the Second Amendment. What's the Second Amendment mean to you?
Second Amendment means a lot of things. The Second Amendment really is, the Second Amendment really gives people the ability not only to defend themselves and defend what they believe in, but really the Second Amendment is a way for people to stand up for what they believe in. Without the Second Amendment, I really kind of think that all the other amendments are kind of useless. The Second Amendment is what ensures our rights, all of our rights, our First Amendment rights, our Fourth Amendment rights, all of our rights. It's really what keeps our government in check against a tyrannical government. Really, it's what assures that they can't do whatever they want, and what keeps us safe. Really.
So what would you say to someone who would say, "Well, you don't need 30 rounds to hunt deer"?
It's not about deer hunting. The Second Amendment was specifically written with the intention, if you keep it in its historical context, it was specifically written at the time because the founding fathers had just fought a war against the tyrannical government. And so that was to make sure that the government could be kept in check. And that's what ensures our rights, our right to say no. And that's really what it's about. It's our right to say no. No, we're not going to be a victim. No, we're not going to be perpetrated upon. And no, we're not going to allow ourselves to be a victim of tyranny.
Have you ever had in-depth discussion about the Second Amendment with someone who is, say, anti-gun? And if so, how'd it go?
I have actually. Oddly enough, working at a gun shop, you strangely enough occasionally do run across the occasional person who is kind of anti-gun, not necessarily for guns. And especially with the beginning of COVID, we had some people who were not necessarily pro-gun, but could kind of see the importance of the value and I don't know if I would say the importance. I would say they saw the value in being able to protect themselves. And then by being able to discuss it with them and being able to have conversation with them, we were kind of able to get them to understand that, hey, this really kind of is the most effective tool to defend yourself. Because really that's what it's all about. It's all about making sure that you have the most effective tool to defend yourself with. If you were going to go out and mow your lawn, you wouldn't do it with a scythe. You wouldn't go out there and do it with the old school push mower with the little spinny cylinder with the blades on it. No, you'd use a modern push
That's
mower.
That's a great analogy. I hadn't heard that one before.
You wouldn't go out there and do it. You could use a modern push mower with the gas engine, but really the way to do it and the way to mow your yard is to have somebody come out with a zero turn and mow your yard properly.
Okay, here's a question for you. When lawmakers want to say that certain firearms are now illegal and we're going to ban them, and certain magazine capacities are now illegal and we're going to ban them, does that infringe on your Second Amendment rights?
I believe it does. I really kind of think it's more of them taking advantage of other people's ignorance. Because if you really stop and look at what it is fundamentally, all of the things that they're trying to ban are just, it's the scary version of something else. All of the rifles that they're trying to ban are not automatic weapons. They're not machine guns. They just look scary. They look like automatic weapons. It's a semi-automatic rifle. Semi-automatic rifle. It does the same thing. One bullet, one trigger pull. It's the same thing.
But those bans lower crime, doesn't it?
No, it doesn't. And really what it is, it's kind of just sort of a stepping stone. If you statistically look, and you'll see that rifles of any kind are very rarely used in crime. And then so since those are very rarely used, the stepping stone is really, well, we'll ban the ARs because they're scary and they're the high profile guns. They're the guns that are used in the high profile incidents. They're the incidents that are used in the quote unquote mass shooting incidents that are all over the news, and they're the ones that draw the most attention. And so what happens is, since that's the thing that's out in the forefront of the media that people see, that's the stuff that they say, well, we should do something about this. And then so that's kind of the thing that people focus their attention on. But the reality is that is a very small portion of what the problem is. And if anybody actually looks into the statistics and looks into what the actual problem is, the vast majority of quote unquote gun violence is inner city violence using handguns. And there's a multitude of reasons why inner city violence takes place, which could be a whole nother video in and of itself. But the thing is that they specifically target specific guns, specific features, because it gives them a starting place. And once they start with that, then nothing really happens, because we all know that what's really doing, what's really being used for criminal purposes is something else. So once they go for this, they can say, well, nothing happened. So then they can ban this, and then they say, well, nothing happened, so we got to do this now. And then they take the next step. And then when that doesn't work, they take the next step, and then the next step, and then the next step.
Whittle away
and then they just kind of chip away at it. And the reality is they really should be focusing on what the actual problem is what the crime statistics are. And the crime statistics show that inner city violence and a lot of the other factors, drugs, money, all kinds of things are really the problem. And it's easier not to deal with that, because if you don't deal with that, you always kind of have that boogeyman out in the dark. And if they don't deal with that, then they have something else to point the finger at.
What's this lack of prosecution for gun crimes? How does that affect our Second Amendment rights?
Well, I really kind of think that the biggest problem is that I don't think that there's necessarily a lack of prosecution. It's a lack of the proper kind of prosecution.
Okay.
As we see, there's definitely a two-tiered justice system where some people are getting just the mere possession of a firearm. They're getting the book thrown at them, and certain individuals are owning firearms illegally and obtaining them illegally, and nothing's happening to them. So it's definitely not a matter of firearms are being prosecuted. It's just a matter of they're not being prosecuted fairly and evenly across the board. And I kind of think that it's definitely a problem. I don't know what the solution to the problem is, but it's definitely a problem.
Yeah, I hear a lot of people say it starts at home and with responsibility and proper upbringing. What's your opinion on that?
I agree with that. I had grown up in martial arts, with martial arts, and my children have been around my house. And as I grew up with martial arts, I was a martial arts instructor. I had all kinds of swords and knives and sticks and all kinds of things around my house, and spears and all that sort of thing. And that sort of thing has always been around my house. It's always kind of been a mainstay. You can't go more than a couple feet around my house without tripping over a sword, as crazy as that sounds. And I know that sounds nuts to a lot of people, and they would say, well, that's really bizarre. But the reality of the situation is that's kind of how it is at my house. And the thing is that my children have never gone out and engaged in quote unquote sword violence.
A lot of discipline goes into martial arts, correct?
Yes, it's one of those things where my kids they've been around it. It never held some kind of mysticism for it. They knew what a sword was. They knew it was dangerous. They knew not to touch it. They respected it. They understood that it could harm not only themselves, but it could harm somebody else if it was used irresponsibly. And so because they understood that from an early age, they treated it with the respect that it deserved. And I think that if you apply that same kind of mentality, even though we're talking about a sword in this particular instance, even though we're talking about that, if we apply that to a firearm, now I'm not advocating leaving firearms out in the open where children can get to them.
Of course.
Obviously, that would be irresponsible.
Yep.
But what I am saying is that if in the event that, a child does come across a firearm, if you've taken the time to educate them properly, you've taken the time to show them, hey, this is a gun. This is what it does. This is how it works. This is what it can do. This is what it can do if you use it irresponsibly. These are the ramifications of what can happen if you are irresponsible with this. And this is what can happen. And these are real life and death consequences. And teach them to give it the responsibility that it does, or the respect that it deserves. They're going to understand that, and they're going to treat it with the respect that it deserves. And they're not going to be irresponsible with it. And I think if you apply that sort of mentality to it, it's going to go a long way.
Cool. You seem very grounded, very well educated when it comes to this topic. How was your upbringing, and how did you formulate your opinion and your knowledge of the Second Amendment?
Oddly enough, I did not grow up with guns at all. We didn't have guns in my household. Generally speaking, my family is actually kind of, not necessarily my dad is anti-guns, but my family as a general rule is kind of anti-guns. I have grown up kind of doing martial arts my whole life. I did martial arts for a long time. I've always, like I said, I've always owned swords and knives and sticks and all that kind of stuff. Um, I actually did not get into owning firearms until about, I think I purchased my first firearm in 2017,
Okay.
which was probably about 6 or 7 years ago. Probably
Yep.
about 7 years ago, maybe 6, 7 years ago. And at that point, I'm just the type of person that when I get into something, I get into it very, I fall down that rabbit hole kind of hard.
Gotcha.
And I just kind of like to learn as much as I can about things, and I kind of get a little obsessive and geeky on a lot of stuff.
Yep.
So for me, it kind of becomes an obsession where I want to learn as much as I can about it.
Yeah.
And then, it's like falling down any other rabbit hole where it just becomes, okay, now I own a gun and now I want to be a good shooter and I want to learn about shooting. And then you kind of fall down that rabbit hole and it's like, oh, well, wait a minute. What about all this Second Amendment 2A rights stuff? And
That's
then
right.
you kind of learn about all the political stuff, and then you learn about all this other stuff, and then you also kind of learn about the technology involved, and then
Yeah.
you're like, oh, hey, cool, optics and all kinds of ballistics and all kinds of stuff. And so it kind of branches out and becomes this it becomes like a multi-headed beast, I guess, if you will, where you kind of learn about a whole lot of facets about the industry. And then somehow I wound up working at a gun shop from just kind of hanging out, and fell into doing holsters just by being a leather worker and making holsters for the guys here at the range. And, it just, as they say, you just kind of fall into it sometimes.
Very cool. So now is your opportunity for your 30-second elevator speech to viewers that may be watching this video that may be a little on the fence about gun rights and what that's all about. What would you say to them?
I would say that your gun rights are a lot more important than you think. As we have seen, especially during COVID, that there are a lot more folks who never thought that they would own firearms. My sister, my mother, my family members who were very anti-gun, they definitely said, things have gotten crazy and maybe I should do something to protect myself. And I would just like to say that for all those people that thought they would never be those people, all of the gun conversation and all of the rights conversations, they include you now too. And that would be my conversation would be, hey, all these things that you thought didn't include you now too. And they're important to all of us.
That was awesome. That was awesome. That was probably the